Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in this morning and anxious to begin another week here at First Amendment Radio. And our discussion about this book we're currently reading, The Papacy and the Civil Power. Remember yesterday, or last time rather, Friday, we were discussing the Council of Constance and this perpetual struggle of the papacy to achieve acclamation as infallible, okay? And we also dealt with a false historian who has misrepresented the events and the canons taking place at the Council of Constance and in favor of the Pope's supremacy and infallibility. So we'll begin backing up to the beginning of the paragraph that we concluded last Friday on page 642, if you're following along in your copy of the book, 642, the first full paragraph within the first third of the page. It says, "It requires but a moment's thought to see that it was impossible in the very nature of things for the fathers of Constance to have stultified themselves by any such declaration as this. It would have been as diametrically opposed to what they actually did as darkness to light." Okay, the author is shedding incredulity upon the historian Wenninger's representation of what took place at that council. And it says, they, that is the council, they had tried, condemned, and deposed Pope John the 23rd, a lawful pope, for innumerable crimes, including heresy, and to have followed such an act with the assertion that it was impossible that the, quote, Pope should err, unquote, would have made them the laughing stock of all Europe. But it is not necessary to argue upon general principles to show how entirely this assertion of Wenninger is without any fact to support it. Dupin says, the decree of the Council of Constance, quote, concerning the authority of the Council above the Pope, did plainly decide the question, and subjected the Pope, as well as to faith as manners, to the judgment of the General Council, unquote, which applied not only to times of schism or where there were rival popes, quote, but generally in all other cases, unquote. So it was unequivocally decided at the Council of Constance that the Pope is just as much a subject of the Council as is the laity of the Roman Catholic Church. The Council, the General Councils convened by the Roman Catholic Church, according to this Council, were the infallible ones. They represented the universal church, and whatever they said had the character of infallibility attached to it, and not the Pope. So there's going to be open warfare, you just have to know, between the papacy and this council. And as we continue, we'll see how that warfare took place. And keep in mind as we read this global controversy between the councils and the popes is nothing but God's act of demonstrating to the world that this is the woman that rides the beast of Revelation chapter 17. Through everything that we're about to read in this book, we'll see once again that God is leaving no excuse for anyone to be deceived by the Roman Catholic Church, demonstrating by this internal quarrel between the councils and the popes over supremacy and over infallibility and all other such like godlike characteristics is simply for the very purpose of exposing this church for what it is, a counterfeit of the true. Okay, I hope I make that clear. Just take everything that we're about to read in this book And remember, it's God exposing this church for what it is. He says, and he gives the reason for this decision, quote, because they deduced the authority of the council above the popes from its representation of the church and from its infallibility, unquote. And when speaking of the bull of Martin V against the errors of the Wycliffites, he says also, quote, that he says also that in the 41st decree, quote, the authority of the universal church is distinguished from that of the Pope, and there it is ordained that the universal church or the general council have a sovereign authority independently, whereas 'tis only said of the Pope that he hath a primacy over other particular churches, which amounts to the same thing with the decision of the council, unquote. So it's inarguably established, at least at this point at the Council of Constance, that the Council of Constance overrules the Pope. Now, this same author asserts, moreover, that after Martin V, Pope Martin V had been elected by the Council of Constance, and while it was yet in session, he, that is Martin V, issued a bull prohibiting all appeals from the Pope to any other tribunal, and that it was approved by the Council. You see how this, even before the smoke cleared, the new Pope issued a bull, in a sense nullifying the councils. And it says the words of this bull given by him are these, quote, it is not lawful for any person to appeal from the Roman pontiff, who is the supreme judge and the vicar of Christ on earth, or by subterfuge to elude his judgment in matters of faith, unquote. Pretty clear, isn't it? I, the Pope, am infallible, and whatever I say is binding upon the church and the councils, right? Now, this statement is untrue, or else Dupin did not understand or has perverted the facts, neither of which is probable. When the council was nearly drawn to a close, a question arose about which there was so much disagreement that the ambassadors of Poland talked about appealing to a future council, a remedy in entire accord with the common sentiment of the time. Pope Martin V, like some of his predecessors, was disposed to avail himself of every opportunity to resist this idea so as to concentrate all the power of the church in his own hands, and accordingly issued the bull alluded to, notwithstanding, as was then declared, it was directly contradictory of what the council had decreed. But it did not receive the sanction of the council, as Wenninger asserts. On the other hand, if the council had acted upon it, there can be no reasonable doubt that it would have not merely rejected, it would have been not merely rejected, but sternly condemned. Dupin says, quote, however, the bull of Martin V containing the prohibition of appealing to the council was not read nor approved in this session of the council, but published in a private assembly of the cardinals. That is, sent out as the popes have generally promulgated their constitutions, with the hope that in the course of time their custom of asserting universality of power would ripen into the force of law. Okay, so this decree of the Pope was brought to the council, but it was not read and it was not approved. And then, in an apparent fit of rejection of rebellion, the Pope simply issued it as a brief after the council had been dismissed, and hoping, therefore, that like all papal briefs and encyclicals, it would be added into the canon law. So the Pope availed himself of the only opportunity, of the only avenue available to him at the time, since the council rejected and didn't even read his proposal. He just issued it and published it after the council. Now, he says they understood full well the nature and import of that principle of their church organization, which construes silence into acquiescence, as do also the hierarchy of the present day. And they acted upon this principle, if not with impunity, at least with courage, until at last it has come to be a part of the settled faith of the church that no layman has any right to inquire what authority a papal decree has been issued, or to what extent it goes, or what it commands to be believed or done, but is bound to accept it as true and obey it accordingly, without any regard to whatsoever human power and authority it may defy. Notwithstanding the contrary assertions of Weninger and other Jesuits, no man can study the history of the Council of Constance without seeing that the infallibility of the Pope was directly contradicted by it, not merely by the act of deposing an obnoxious and heretical pope and electing another in his place, but by the enactment of a decree to that effect which was approved by Pope Martin V. And if it be true, as alleged, that Pope Martin V, after approving this decree, endeavored to counteract its effect by a papal bull, of which there seems to be no doubt, he is presented to all impartial minds in the attitude of having played a double part, of having misled the council by the pretense of approving what it did, while at the same time he cherished the purpose of resisting it at the earliest opportunity. But this is nothing new at all in the conduct of the popes, who in building up the wonderful system of the papacy have taken care to reserve to themselves the right of doing whatsoever they may suppose the interest of the church requires, without any regard whatever to what they themselves or any others have said or done. Pope Martin V found ample justification for his duplicity in the example of many of his predecessors, and only increased the number of those popes whose conduct has since added to the significance of that precedent. Just one pope right after another, one council right after another, contradicting themselves, issuing bulls of excommunication and anathemas and damnations against one another, conciliar canons passed against the popes, back and forth, warring back and forth. It's nothing but a circus of errors. And it has taken place over the course of centuries, millennia, 2 millennia. And it's time for the world to simply acknowledge this church for what it is, a counterfeit, and a very weak one at best. I assert more positively that it is not the Church of Jesus Christ, but the very church of Antichrist. Now, we're going to continue with the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, in chapter 21 of the book. We begin talking about further councils of the Roman Catholic Church and this struggle for supremacy between the popes and the councils. We're going to be talking about the councils of Basel and Florence. R.W. Thompson says, it is so positively and dogmatically asserted that the Pope's infallibility was recognized by the Council of Florence, that in order to know whether it is to be accepted as a fact or rejected, we must understand the character of that council, the circumstances which led to it, and the nature of its decrees. The Church at the time of the 2 councils of Basel and Florence was fearfully rent by a most disgraceful schism. The Council of Constance, only a few years before, which we've been just now talking about, the Council of Constance, only a few years before had appointed a council to meet at Pavia, which had the sanction and approval of Pope Martin V. This fixed its ecumenical character, and when it did afterwards meet in 1423 and was attended by 5 legates of the Pope and by deputies from France, Germany, and England, it, of course, retained this character. It was therefore an ecumenical council at the beginning, according to the principles then and now universally recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. It was subsequently transferred to Basel, where it was presided over by a legate of Pope Eugenius IV, his immediate successor Martin V having, in the meantime, died. One of the first questions that came before it was that which had been decided by the Council of Constance, involving the relative powers of popes and councils. It became apparent at once to the Pope that the council would decide, as that at Constance had done, in favor of its own and against his authority. In other words, that it possessed the rightful power to settle and prescribe the faith independently of the Pope, and that the Pope had no such power without its consent, because it alone represented the universal church. To prevent this, key words here, to prevent this, Pope Eugenius IV immediately began a most disreputable war against the council, intending, if possible, at whatever cost and or injury to the church, to defeat this action. He did not hesitate to inaugurate a war between the church and the papacy, the former represented by a regularly organized ecumenical council, and the latter by the Pope alone. He undoubtedly supposed that the times were favorable to the recognition of the claim of papal supremacy and infallibility, a supposition well warranted by the condition of affairs then existing. The long residence of popes at Avignon, France, had corrupted the highest authorities of the Church to so fearful an extent, and the disgraceful schisms existing but a little while before had so rent the Church into factions that it only required a bold and courageous pope to bring the bishops into obedience, especially then when they were assured that they would be the sharers with him of whatsoever power he should acquire over the lay members of the Church. Therefore, Pope Eugenius IV, in the very first step taken by him, exhibited a determination to take advantage of the times and bring the whole Church to his feet at a single blow. He was determined to lose nothing by equivocation, and accordingly, as if he were already dictator, commanded his legate to transfer the council to Bologna, where he could preside over it in person and thus direct and control its action. Acting under the protection of Emperor Sigismund, the legate refused to obey this insolent command, whereupon the Pope, greatly incensed, published a bull dissolving the council, a course of proceeding both factious and disorganizing. In the meantime, and before this bull was issued, the council had passed a decree to the effect that, quote, every person of whatsoever state or dignity, even the Pope himself, is bound to obey it in what concerns the faith, unquote, and another denying the right of the Pope to dissolve it. This issue was thus distinctly made. The Pope on one side, representing himself alone, the Council on the other, representing the whole Church. One or the other had to recede, or divide the Church, separate its body from its head. The Council, backed by the Emperor, sent a deputation to the Pope earnestly desiring him to recall his bull of dissolution. The Pope refused, whereupon the Council renewed their former decrees and declared that, as they were abandoned by the Pope, it was their duty to provide for the necessity of the church, quote, as the Holy Spirit should dictate to them, unquote. They summoned the Pope to attend in person. This he also refused and was declared contumacious. He was then notified that unless he appeared at a fixed time, he would be proceeded against. The council declared also that no prelate should attend a council at any other place under the penalty of excommunication. And obviously they anticipated that the Pope, in defiance, would call his own council at some other location. They took steps to block that process. It says it manifestly did not desire to press matters to an extremity with the Pope, unless by his conduct he rendered it impossible for them to do otherwise. They accordingly deferred any final action several times to give him every possible opportunity of seeing that the welfare of the church required the restoration of the pacific relations between them. The Pope, however, when he found the council resolved to treat him as contumacious and to deal with him accordingly, solicited 10 more days of delay, which were readily granted to him. He thus acknowledged the jurisdiction of the council over him, and again asked for additional delay of 90 days, which was also granted. During the third year of the council, the Pope sent his pontifical bull, wherein he declared that the council was lawful, that it ought to continue without dissolution, that he annulled and revoked his bull dissolving it, that he approved it, and would do nothing prejudicial to it. Earnestly desiring reconciliation, it, that is the council, accepted this bull as satisfactory and admitted the Pope's legate upon their taking an oath to approve the decrees of the Council of Constance, the preceding council, remember? And thus peace was seemingly restored upon the basis of the superiority of a council over a pope. The Pope having, by his last bull, proposed and agreed to this as the basis of an adjustment. Okay? So for all intents and purposes, it looks like they've met with an acquiescence by the Pope in concession to the councils. But as we continue reading, we're going to find out just how diabolical and untrustworthy these popes are. Now we have a seeming peace that has transpired, a ceasefire. But let's see what R.W. Thompson now reveals. He says, but it was only seemingly restored. The Pope soon made up his mind to falsify his own promise and to get rid of the troublesome fathers of Basel in some way. It mattered little to him how. He was playing the game for empire, and like other pretentious potentates, considered himself entitled to do with impunity what the universal laws of ethics forbids without dishonor. The papacy is dishonor. And we'll continue when we get back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org. The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you love Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio. They sponsor the program. Inquisition Update is about truth that is not politically correct. It's about revealing the Vatican's hand in the governments of the world. It's about the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order. The truth is not commercially viable. Inquisition Update will never be picked up by the mainstream media or even the alternative media. It is First Amendment Radio that sees the value of Inquisition Update and puts Inquisition Update on the air. It's a truth that you won't hear from the mainstream media, who protects the papacy. You won't even hear it from the most popular of the alternative medias like Alex Jones, because he protects the papacy. You'll only hear it here on First Amendment Radio. Please support First Amendment Radio. Now, we're going to continue with our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. There has been an apparent truce struck by the papacy and this particular council, but it's just an appearance of peace. The war is raging on, and it says the Pope soon made up his mind to falsify his own promise and to get rid of the troublesome fathers of Basel in some way. It mattered little to him how. Now compare this with Christ. Is this the Church of Jesus Christ? Would Jesus Christ make up his mind to falsify his own promise? No. He said, I will not alter a thing that cometh forth from my mouth. Another perfect distinction between Christ and Antichrist. It says, the Pope soon made up his mind to falsify his own promise and to get rid of the troublesome fathers of Basel in some way. It mattered little to him how. He was playing the game for empire. and like other pretentious potentates, considered himself entitled to do with impunity what the universal law of ethics forbids without dishonor. Accordingly, while the fathers were engaged in faithful exertions to bring about a union with the Greek Christians, he, the Pope, by his emissaries, was constantly engaged in plotting against them. He issued a bull to transfer the council, this time to Florence. Baffled again in this, he issued another transferring it to Ferrara. Here at last, quote, some Italian bishops, unquote, with a single cardinal, met and organized a rival council, which immediately proceeded to enact that the council at Basel was illegal and its acts void. It will be seen at once that such a council as this was schismatical, unless the whole power of the Church were taken away from its legitimate and only representative body and transferred to the Pope. Two councils could not lawfully sit at the same time, and as that at Basel had been legally called and organized, this assemblage at Ferrara was manifestly irregular and factious. Insofar as the Pope himself was concerned, it was fraudulent, for in the act of convening it, he violated the promise made in his bull sent to the Council of Basel. But the two councils did sit at the same time, each having its own representative character, that at Basel representing the Church, that at Ferrara representing the Pope. The former remained almost entirely unreduced in numbers, being deserted only by the Pope's legate and 4 prelates. These followed their master and the few other Italian prelates to Ferrara, while all the other prelates, with the ambassadors of princes, remained at Basel, representing nearly the entire Church. The Council of Basel, driven at last to extremities by the factious and malignant conduct of the Pope, proceeded with his trial. He was accused by it, among other things, of simony and breaking his oath, and being found guilty, a decree was adopted which, quote, declared Eugenius suspended from all kind of administration of the papal power, as well in spirituals as in temporals, which had now devolved on the council. They decreed that all he did should be null and forbade all sorts of persons to obey him under pain of excommunication, unquote. Measures of resistance were adopted by the Pope, who caused the prelates at Ferrara to declare all these proceedings void, and he issued another papal bull to that effect, commanding those at Basel to come to Ferrara, and pronounced excommunications against those who would not. He enjoined the magistrates and the inhabitants of Basel, quote, to force them away under pain of excommunication and an interdict, and in case they should not do it, he forbade all persons to enter within the city under the same pains, and enjoined all merchants to withdraw from it, unquote. What a mild and Christian temper did this infallible pontiff display! In dealing with the Basilian fathers who represented the Church, he exhibited that malignity which bad men always show when balked in the pursuit of unworthy enterprises. But the council at Basel was not intimidated, and retaliated by decreeing that at Ferrara was illegal, and all its proceedings null. There seemed to be no oil of Christian character to pour upon the troubled waters. Everything was cursing and anathema. In the meantime, the Greeks who had been invited to the Council of Basel to attend it were on their way to the west, and the Pope inaugurated measures to draw them away from Basel to Ferrara, upon the pretext that the prelates at Basel were schismatic because they had opposed him. In this, he succeeded, and the negotiations were commenced for setting the terms of union between the Greek and the Latin Christians. These lasted for some time. The Pope insisted that the primacy denied him at Basel should be recognized, but the Greeks refused. The controversy was attended with a great deal of violence, but no compromise was agreed upon at Ferrara. The Pope issued another bull, transferring his council from there to Florence, where it could be more directly surrounded by Italian influences and consequently more subject to his dictation. After it reached Florence, much time was consumed in discussions about the procession of the Holy Ghost and the phraseology to be used in expressing the nature and extent of the Pope's power. He desired an unqualified expression of his primacy over both spirituals and temporals, the very opposite of what had been declared at Constance and at Basel. His object was to have it so broadly set forth as to show that his power was plenary over everything, including councils and even the canon laws of the Church. To this the Greeks were unwilling, because such a concession by them would admit the inferiority of the Church of Constantinople to that at Rome, whereas they had always maintained that each of them possessed equal authority within its own jurisdiction. They would not consent to go farther than the first council of Constantinople had gone, more than 1,000 years before, which was to concede to Rome the rank of honor, on account of its having been the old imperial city. This, they insisted, would be sufficiently indicated by a decree which should provide for the primacy of the Pope within the limitations fixed by the decrees of the ecumenical councils and the canon law. That is, that in the exercise of his primacy, he should obey these. The issue was a very plain one, and required the employment of an unusual degree of diplomatic skills on the part of the Pope and his adherents. He was dealing exclusively with those who had been cut off from the Roman or the Latin Church by the sword of excommunication, and were therefore heretics. You see, you have to realize that the Roman Catholic Church regards the Eastern Church that calls itself Orthodox, the Greek Church, those whose center of ecclesiastical and temporal powers at Constantinople, that these are schismatics and heretics, having rejected the primacy of the papacy and the primacy of the Roman Catholic Church. And yet here they have been invited to this Pope's council in order to bolster the Pope's infallibility and his standing, while at the same time the Pope regards these as heretics who attended from the East, from Constantinople. He says he was dealing exclusively with those who had been cut off from the Roman or the Latin Church by the sword of excommunication, and therefore were heretics. And his manifest object was to entrap them into an agreement as to the extent of his power, which he could fling into the faces of the Latin Christians. These latter were then regularly assembled at the Council of Basel, from which he had been able to draw off only the Italian prelates and a few others, leaving the great bulk of the Church still faithful to the decrees of the Council of Constance. And the Pope understood perfectly well that if the statement of the Latin Christians were honestly expressed, it would remain thus faithful. Therefore, he employed the utmost skill and assiduity to procuring such an act of assent from the Greek heretics as would enable him to set up some claim of right to resist this sentiment and to disregard the decrees of the Council of Constance and of Basel. In other words, he desired to employ the Greeks only for the purpose of subverting one of the fundamental principles of the faith of the Latin Church, that he might be enabled thereby to bring the whole Church to his feet and make the Pope alone, as its infallible head, the sole custodian of all its authority, the sole guardian of all its rights, and the sole dictator of its faith. How far this papal artifice succeeded will appear in the sequel. As furnishing one of the best modes of interpreting the results, it is necessary to observe that the chief action of this Council of Florence was in the nature of a treaty between the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople and their followers, with reference alone to a union between the Latin and the Greek Christians, and not for the settlement of questions of faith. Certainly it cannot be pretended by anybody that the Greeks had any authority whatever to decide upon matters of faith, so as to bind the Latin Christians, until they had first made such atonement as would remove the sentence of excommunication and restore them to Christian fellowship. Their first visit to the West and all these negotiations had this principal object, and therefore what they did or assented to cannot, in any just sense, be considered as a part of the faith, unless also assented to by such regularly constituted authorities of the Church as were then recognized as having the right to bind the Church. The parties had no special difficulty in agreeing to such general terms as would express the primacy of the Pope and his headship over the universal Church. They, however, understood these terms differently. The Pope considered them as a concession of his infallibility, along with that decree of spiritual power which included jurisdiction over temporals, while the Patriarch and the Greek Christians understood them as conferring the utmost degree of honor, but no such authority as should justify the Pope in invading their local jurisdictions. The Greeks, not being disposed to make the concession to the former sense, it became necessary to insert some terms of limitations or qualifications which should serve to interpret the meaning of the treaty in order to obtain their assent. The Pope proposed to insert, after the words declaring his primacy, the power to feed, rule, and govern the Church, these words, quote, according to Scripture and the writings of the saints, unquote. But to this, the Greeks could not, of course, consent without surrendering everything. They could easily see that the proposition had the stamp of trickery upon it. Finally, however, a treaty was agreed to wherein the words proposed by the Pope were so changed as to express the idea that the Pope had the power as the head of the Church to govern it according to the acts of ecumenical councils and the canons of the Church. To this we must refer presently in order to see what its precise meaning is, since it is the basis of the papal claim of infallibility. But whatever its meaning is, it was the best the Pope could do. It may be fairly supposed that he was only reconciled to it in that form, because he saw the possibility of so perverting its terms as to base the claim of infallibility upon it and his own superiority to councils, especially if the Greeks should withdraw from it, and he should be left alone as the only contracting party authorized to interpret its meaning. At all events, he soon found himself in this position. For the Greek Christians at Constantinople, when they learned what had been done, disagreed to and repudiated the Treaty of Settlement, and thus the effort at union proved abortive, and the compact made at Florence fell to the ground. This left it, of course, entirely worthless of all practical purposes unless the Pope could secure influence enough to gather up its repudiated provisions and impose them upon the Latin Christians as the law of the Church, in opposition to the decrees of Constance and Basil. In other words, unless he could reduce the Latin Christians to such a degree of submission and obedience as to compel them to accept their faith, not from their own legally constituted and assembled councils, but from the heretical Greeks, merely because by all sorts of art and intrigue they had been enticed into an agreement which, if it did elevate the Pope, most certainly humiliated the Latin Church. There's nothing to justify the assertion that the Latin Christians assented to these proceedings at Florence. Those of them who attended the council held there under the auspices of the Pope were only such as he had succeeded in drawing away from Basil. The agreement made there took the form of a consular decree only because it was signed by those who followed the Pope. Of the Latins, these were, besides the Pope, only 8 cardinals and 2 patriarchs, one from Jerusalem and one from Grado, 2 bishops, ambassadors of the Duke of Burgundy, 8 archbishops, 47 bishops, 4 heads of orders, 41 abbots, and the archdeacon of Troyes, only 113 in all, while the council at Basel was attended by the recognized representatives of all the remainder of the Latin Christians, and had the sanction and approval of the Roman Catholic princes. Consequently, when the Greek Christians refused to be bound by the treaty, the only support it had left in all of Christendom was this schismatical faction of the Pope. The Council of Basel still represented the Church and continued its sessions. It reaffirmed its previous decree and that of Constance, wherein it was declared that a council was superior to the Pope, and more formally than before deposed Eugenius IV. When this formal act of deposition was passed, there were 39 prelates and nearly 300 ecclesiastics present, about 3 times as many as signed the decree at Florence. They declared him, quote, disobedient to the commands of the universal church, one that persists in his rebellion, a violator and condemner of the holy synodical canons, a disturber of the peace and unity, one that gives open scandal to the whole church, simoniacal, perjured, incorrigible, schismatical, heretical, etc. This was undoubtedly the act of a large majority, in fact, of nearly the whole of the Latin Christians, speaking in the only mode then known to their church organization. The historian Dupin says that at that time, quote, some prelates, unquote, were with the Pope at Florence, and we have seen that their number was insignificant compared to that of those who remained at Basel. Consequently, the Basilian fathers, after having deposed Eugenius IV, were compelled to elect a successor to him. They did elect Pope Felix V. The combat now thickened, and bulls and other papal weapons were hurled from side to side with no less fierceness than with velocity. Pope Eugenius flung his bull at the head of Pope Felix, declaring him heretical and schismatical and excommunicating all his supporters, that is, condemning them to eternal perdition, all the Basilian fathers and the bulk of the Christian world, for daring to deny to him the right to clothe himself in the robes of deity. The Council of Basel retaliated by declaring the bull null and signified their contempt of it by consecrating Felix as pope. The struggle waxed warmer and warmer. Deputies from each party were dispatched to secure the approbation of the princes. The kings of France and England hesitated and desired a compromise. Aragon, Hungary, Bavaria, Poland, and Austria took the side of Felix and the Basilian prelates. The universities of Paris, Germany, Krakow wrote theses acknowledging Felix and maintaining the authority of the councils above the popes. Another general council was suggested, but neither party would agree to it. And the consequence was that the schism thus created by Eugenius in attempting to force the recognition of his infallibility upon the church and to destroy a legally convened ecumenical council lasted until his death, which occurred after the councils of Basel and Florence had both terminated their sessions. Pope Nicholas V was elected pope by those who espoused the cause of Eugenius. Being of a meek and peaceful temper, he agreed to the suggestions of the princes with a view to compromise. The final result was such an accommodation of the difficulty upon the conditions that Felix should resign and be made chief cardinal, that all the excommunications and censures on both sides should be revoked, and that, quote, also the decrees, dispositions, and regulations they had made should be confirmed, unquote. This arrangement was carried into effect, and Nicholas V issued a bull accordingly, approving the decrees of both the Council of Florence and that of Basel. It approved both Florence and Basel. And the war continues in direct contradistinction between the peace of Christ, the true Christ. God is exposing Antichrist in all of this history. It's important for you to know, and we'll continue on the program tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.